Good morning, friends. My name is Biraj Patnaik, and I head the National Foundation for India. But I'm here for a very different reason, which is my organization doesn't work on food and nutrition. But this is something that I have been involved in for the last almost 3 decades now. And I wanted to share with you, how public policy making works, right? Or at least used to work earlier. Don't try it at home now, as they say. But there was a time when public policy or all drivers of social change worked very differently from the way it works today. And I'm very cognizant of that because we have a whole new generation of people now. Especially, I see a lot of young people in the room who are in their professional lives in the last 10 years, 15 years, who've not really seen, or been part of processes which led to, let's say, the legislation on the National Food Security Act, or the legislation on the right to education, or the legislation on the right to information. There is no sense, I find, among students today on the linkage between how grassroots action can be combined with advocacy, can be combined with the courts, can be combined with judicial activism, can be combined with campaigning on the streets to lead to positive social outcomes in the form of schemes, programs, laws, policies, or even broader questions of social change. And of course, because Lancaster has done it on food, so I'll speak to the food question. Uh, Now, if, as you know, we have a uh, very deep basket of social programming around food. We have serious problems, of course, in terms of malnutrition. I don't want to go through the numbers because I have Deepa speaking after me, very cognizant of that, and what she's forgotten about these things is much more than what I'll ever know. So I'll leave all that to her. I want to weave in a story more around the policy narrative on how this came about. So we have a very deep basket of public policy programming around food. So much so that from the cradle to the grave, or from the womb to the tomb, you have some program or the other that covers the broader social protection network around food. So you have, even before you are born, you have a maternity entitlement program which takes care of the pregnant mother while the baby is in the womb. Then when you are birth, you have ANC, PNC, ICDS services. Then you get the midday meal till the age of upper primary, which is the age of 14. Then you have access in the meantime also to the public distribution system. Then you have the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which gives you 100 days of labor, 100 days of work at minimum wages, which is committed by the state. Anyone in a rural area can demand up to 100 days of work at minimum wage. And of course, NREGA wage rates differ from state to state. But what it does is it sets a floor wage for minimum wage across the country. And then you have, after you've had your working life, you have old age or disability or other pensions, and so it goes. And there used to be a program, I don't know if it's still there, but for BPL households, after you die, there was a 10,000 rupees allocation that was given. So literally from the cradle to from the womb to the tomb or cradle to the grave, you have some program or the other that's been covered. A lot of this programming has happened in the last, let's say between 2000 and 2014, right? Uh, the legislations, the rights that were created around this happened pre 2014. It happened in the early 2000s, and it's very interesting because they actually happened initially because of judicial activism. Now, again, this is not something that most of you would know, but we've come out of that period in our country's history. But right up till the 90s, you had large scale starvation deaths in many parts of the country. And the irony was that we also had some of the largest stockholding of any country in the world through the public distribution system. Because, as you know, our public distribution system is twofold. One, it provides farmers a minimum support guarantee for the price of the food grain at the time of harvest. Because if you left it to the market, demand supply, then you wouldn't have, the prices would be really depressed, right? So in order to set a flow level, it's the minimum. It doesn't cover all costs for many crops often, but you have that. And then the government stores that food grains and distributes it through the various food schemes, primarily the public distribution system. And in the 90s, we had an extraordinary situation where we had almost 37 million tons or whatever of food grains in our godowns of the Food Corporation of India, at a time when there was severe drought in many parts of the country, and you literally had people dying of starvation across. And a group of public-minded individuals from an organization called People's Union for Civil Liberties, which is formed during the emergency. It's an organization of lawyers, but now it works on a broad range of issues. They went to the Supreme Court with a very simple petition. And that petition was as follows, that the right to food, while not identified as a fundamental right, is actually a fundamental right, because you have in our constitution the right to life. And the petitioners argued that you can't have a right to life if you do not have a right to food. Can you live without food? You can't. So how can you have a right to life which is independent of the right to food? And they collected affidavits, and we were all part of the process to do that from across the country, and went to the court. And in 2001, and when PUCL filed this case, not many people were very hopeful that something will come of it, because there are hundreds of petitions in the Supreme Court at any point in time. But extraordinarily, when the court looked at the data and they saw, and people like Jean and others had also presented the data in a way which was very easily understandable. For instance, the argument that was made was the food stocks in the godown, which were literally rotting. If you piled one bag over the other, it could go up to the moon and come back. That's the amount of food grains we had, and yet people were dying. So it was completely, it beat common sense. Now, the Supreme Court did a few very interesting things. In November 2001, they passed a series of very landmark orders. Of course, as you know, that in our constitution, you have the fundamental rights and you have the directive principles of state policy. And the fundamental rights largely pertain to the civil and political rights, right? And there is a logic behind that. There are many streams around why we got around to settling on this, but primarily it was that, look, if you made socioeconomic rights as fundamental rights, which the state was the principal duty bearer and beholden to apply, then you would not have been able to achieve it in 1947, because after all, we were a very poor country. I mean, we still are. But at that time, we were extraordinarily poor. We just had 200 years of colonial rule. We did not have the resources. And so the lawmakers in their wisdom said that, look, let's park this as, what we call the progressive realization. That yes, these are rights. This is how state policy should be run. And we will progressively realize these rights. And if you recall Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar's speech when he was presenting the constitution in parliament, Ambedkar said that I'm giving you this constitution, but unless and until every Indian is free from want, from hunger, you will never have a true democracy. That these may be directive principles, but you cannot have true democracy in India till the needs of every Indian is met. And that was the argument to the court, that look, this is a fundamental right. How can you, 50 years after independence, say that we don't have enough food to feed our people when our godowns are overflowing? So the Supreme Court at that point passed this order in November 2001. Number one, saying that we accept the argument. The right to food is a fundamental right, because you cannot have food without, you cannot live without food. And there have been a series of court orders from the 1975s or post-emergency on the right to life, which have clearly articulated, in the language of the orders were very clear in Maneka Gandhi versus others, in other court cases, that the right to food is not, the right to life is not one that of animal existence, right? You cannot live like an animal without the basic needs, and it encompasses all other rights. So, leaning on the jurisprudence from there, the Supreme Court said two things. One, they said, this is not just a problem of Rajasthan. Please get us data from across the country. and tell us what is the situation across the country. Number one. Number two, they said that the right to food is a fundamental right. And therefore, the state should tell us what they are doing to ensure that people have this right. So they declare the right to food a fundamental right. The state, of course, then came up and said, "Oh, we are doing everything. We have a midday meal scheme. We have ICDS. We have this program and we have that program. None of which were, of course, working. For instance, the midday meal at that point was only applicable in tribal blocks, and it was dry rations at the end of the month." And it was given only in ITDP, what we call ITDP blocks, and it was not a functional program across the country. Similarly, the ICDS had about 500,000 centers. There was no universal coverage. The principle of universality was not recognized in the scheme, and these were all programs. So when government presented these programs, the petitioners said, okay, now that it's a right, these programs are not just schemes, right? These are now entitlements. And therefore, the entitlement has to be universal. The state has to guarantee it. And these entitlements must be converted, backed with budgets and a programmatic design that cannot be tinkered by the state, by executive order. It can only be done by legislation. Because now if the Supreme Court order says that the right to food is a fundamental right, it becomes the law of the land, In India, as you know, that an order of the Supreme Court is equivalent to a law passed by Parliament, unless there is legislation that, and the court is within its powers to overturn that legislation. And that's how you came. Now, how is the right exercised? If you say I have a right to food, it is exercised primarily through a series of entitlements that the state guarantees, right? And that right to food, it's a very simple thing, you may say. Everybody has a right to food. But what does it really mean in practice? What it means is that every category of citizen or resident, every human being would have a different entitlement linked to the right to food, right? So if you were a infant of less than 6 months, what's your right to food? Breastfeeding, because you should be exclusively breastfed in the first 6 months. Where does the state come into this? Mother has to feed a baby. Does the state come into this? Can this become an entitlement? Yes or no? Yeah? How? There are milk banks, okay. What else?
Ensuring mother's nutrition.
Absolutely. Ensuring mother's nutrition. Very good. Because if the mother is not well nourished, she will not be able to provide the breast milk that's required by the baby. What else? Okay, provisioning for breastfeeding in public spaces. What else? Sorry? Well-being of the mother and the family. Okay, but what other entitlements can there be? What is the basic thing? What function is the mother playing? She's playing a very key reproductive function, right? And it is unpaid labor, right? Because if you're breastfeeding, you cannot work. So, of course, after the baby starts complementary feeding, you can take it to a creche or wherever. But no mother should be expected to work for 6 months if she's feeding the baby. And this entitlement linked to this, therefore, becomes the compensation of mother for wage labor for those 6 months, which is known as a maternity entitlement. Of course, we don't have such a generous program. What we managed to get through the law was only 6,000 rupees, which doesn't compensate for 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding. But be that as it may, for that child, for that infant, the right to food, the state's responsibility therefore becomes that the mother is well nourished, that you have provision for creches, that you have, which is now there in the law everywhere, including in the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, and that you have compensation paid to the mother for time off so that her health and well-being is protected while she's breastfeeding the baby. Similarly, for a really old person who lives in a village, who's disabled, let's say, and is unable to fend for themselves, the right to food, the best way to ensure the right to food is probably a community kitchen where they can actually go and eat, because dry rations from the ration will not make sense to them because they are unable to cook, and so on and so forth. So I don't want to get into too much depth because I just have 40 minutes or so to speak, and we take on questions. But every segment of the population therefore has a different right. And then the Supreme Court in the next hearing said Wonderful if the government is doing such great work and they have all these programs. We are now making it as an entitlement. Now, what's the difference between an entitlement and a scheme? What's the difference? Government says I have a scheme, okay, and I'm providing a meal. Court says no, this is an entitlement, a legal entitlement.
You cannot claim scheme as right. You can claim entitlement as right.
Schemes are not binding.
Right.
Schemes are for number of people, limited number of people, and entitlement is for all.
Okay, very good. So, three things that let me just refine this. One is that a scheme is not binding on the state. The state can change a scheme. A right is binding. You cannot say that if I have freedom of speech, that I have a freedom of speech only if I am wearing a brown trousers, right? I mean, if I wear a red trouser tomorrow, I still have the freedom of speech. It's not limited by this. Second is that a scheme is not justiciable in a court of law. Government may draw up a scheme in a way where it excludes certain people or includes certain people, but I cannot go to court and say that look, this was my right. State can say, yeah, it was, but you may consider it a right, but for us it's a scheme. The fiscal landscape has changed, so we have changed the program. Right? Now that's the primary difference between a law that is legislated by Parliament and something that comes out of a goodwill of the state to create a program. Because everything that the state does is not linked to a legislation. It may be linked in a broader way, but not very directly so. So the court said, wonderful. Now, if that's the case, we are going to have these as entitlements. And since the petitioners have shown such a big gap, now we will monitor them. These entitlements are justiciable. We will put in a mechanism to monitor them. And that's when the state completely lost it. I mean, this case is the right to food case, or PUCL versus Union of India, writ petition 196 of 2001, is the longest continuing, or was rather, the longest continuing mandamus on a socio-economic right anywhere in the world. It went on from 2001 till 2017. And there are cases still in the court today in 2024 which are linked to the right to food case on migrant workers, rations, and so on. Now, when this happened, there was complete panic, because what it meant was that every entitlement now had to be, because we as the petitioners argued that it had to be universal. Simultaneously, while this case was going on, there was a lot of because we are collecting affidavits from different states and building up this case, a lot of groups across the country started getting involved, because they felt that this was so fundamental to them, and it went way beyond Rajasthan. And the Right to Food campaign was born, which ultimately had about 4,000-5,000 groups from across the country which came together to work on this case and to campaign for these rights. Now, if you take a simple example, the Midday Meal Scheme. In theory, you had a midday meal which is dry rations. But we told the court that it's not working, and that dry ration was linked to your attendance in school. It was only in, I think, 75 ITDA blocks or whatever. Very, very limited program. There was no hot cooked meal in the schemes, except in the state of Tamil Nadu and a couple of other places, smaller states, which had a different history to how the midday meal came about. But other than that, it was not, there was no scheme for across. And suddenly we come up and say, well, there are 170 million children or 200 million kids in primary to upper primary. Now give them a hot cooked meal that's served. And not only that, because this was a research-based case and campaign, and we took a lot of effort to get the details out. If you read the order, the Supreme Court actually then went into what the meal should be. It said, 100 grams of protein, 100 grams of calories per meal, plus 5 to 8 grams of protein, which is dal, and so on and so forth. And it has to be cooked in the premises. It has to be a hot cooked meal. It has to be a nourishing meal. Then we added on that the cooks who cook these meals should preferably be either Dalits or should be Adivasis, in order to break the social barriers, particularly with Dalit cooks. And it is all there in the Supreme Court order. And suddenly the government thought, from the expenditure on just this one program was going up by 400, 500 times. This is a $10 billion a year program. whereas they were spending only a few hundred crores. So they resisted and they said, sorry, we can't do this. I mean, what is this? This is not the court's domain. And they realized that this is only one program. Now, of course, it was their folly, because if they had said earlier that we are not doing it and we are unable to do it, it would have been a different argument. But here the state said we are already doing it, right? Mr. Vajpayee was the prime minister at that point in time, and all hell broke loose because government said we can't do this program. But then, and I distinctly remember that day because, of course, I used to work in the court commissioners as part of the court commissioners setup, which was set up by the Supreme Court, and I'll come to that later. I was in court that day, and while the Solicitor General was arguing that why the government cannot do it because of the fiscal burden that it would place on the state, I mean, the judges said, look, you cannot have a situation today after 50 years when you come and tell us that you have no money. And he used this phrase that has stayed in my mind. He said, Mr. Solicitor General, please tighten your belt elsewhere, but ensure that this program is implemented. And then, of course, they had to do it because it was also, there was a large public outcry because the campaign was mobilizing the media. There were public hearings being held across the country. There were demonstrations saying we want a midday meal. They were feeding children on the streets that if the state cannot feed, then we will feed. And therefore, because of this public campaigning that happened during that period, what happened essentially was that the state had to implement the scheme. And of course, there were fiscal constraints, or so they said. So they introduced a 2 rupee cess on petrol. If you remember, at that point in time, there was a cess on petrol, which still continues, called the education cess. And that education cess fundamentally made sure that the money for the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan was available, which also included the midday meal scheme. So ultimately, when it came to the money, the government was able to raise the money without any problems. And fortunately for us, at that point, Prime Minister Vajpayee, who's the BJP Prime Minister at that time, was deeply committed to the idea of the midday meal scheme. I mean, he thought that, look, he saw the logic and he told his bureaucrats that we must have this because after all, how can you have a country where children are still sleeping hungry? We can't have starvation deaths. Similarly, the battle went on with ICDS. There was a separate battle because you had only 500,000 creches, ICDS centers across the country. You didn't have creches anywhere in the country. And the requirement that the campaign had drawn up, both rural and urban, for ICDS was 1.8 million. And again, there was great resistance from the state. Because just imagine one ICDS center. It has a center, there's a building, there's a worker, there is a helper, there's a cook. There's, and a range of services are provided out of that. It's the only institutional mechanism for children under the age of 6. So the state threw up its hand, said it's not possible, that we can't do it. But then, by then, there was already a mechanism in place called the Supreme Court Commissioners, who were mandated by the court to ensure compliance, and they made sure that this happened. Now, how did the court commissioners come about? Every time we'd file an affidavit, the government would counter it saying we are doing wonderful work, right? And then we, at some point, there used to be a scheme called the Antodaya Yojana. And Antodaya Yojana was 35 kilos of free food grains to the most destitute. And there used to be Annapurna Anna Yojana. Deepa, it was Annapurna Anna Yojana, no? Which was 15 kilos. 10 kilos of free food grains. Annapurna Anna Yojana, which was 10 kilos of free food grains. So we found that in 9 states or 10 states, not a single beneficiary or rights holder had been identified as part of this program. So we resisted and we said, look, we can't have this situation, why is it that these programs don't exist? You won't believe it that 8 states, including the state of Delhi, the state of Himachal, the state of Uttarakhand, 8 states in the country filed affidavits in the Supreme Court saying that the reason they couldn't identify anyone to benefit from this program is because this program is for the poorest of the poor. And in our state, there is no one who is poorest of the poor. Now, this is a claim that even the most advanced developed societies, even the Swiss can't say that they don't have, or the Luxembourg or Monaco cannot say that they have no homeless, they have no, it's a ridiculous claim, right? And that's when the court really cracked the whip and they said, look, we left it to the state to implement. And you have come back to us saying you can't identify the poor. We are in Delhi. In Delhi, we step out of our houses, we see homeless people on the streets. So the court then cracked the whip and said, okay, we will now have our own independent monitoring mechanism with very sweeping powers. And that included that no program of the government which concerned food or employment. So every food and employment program of the government will now be monitored by the Supreme Court Commissioner's office. They will report directly to the bench, and they are free to file contempt of court charges against the chief secretaries of the state who do not comply with the court's orders. So you suddenly had a very empowered mechanism that I was part of that was now looking at every scheme in every state. And Deepa and I worked for almost a decade, a little more than a decade actually, in the court commissioner's office, about 13 years, to put this in place and to ensure that state by state, district by district, compliance happened. And I remember once ICDS was the hardest to crack when it did not happen. On just one single occasion, there were like 8 chief secretaries of states who were summoned. We filed contempt charges against 13 chief secretaries during the the case. And on one occasion, there were 8 chief secretaries who were made to personally appear before the court and sit there all day. And the judge would keep postponing the hearing so that they sit, and they wanted their presence in the court. And then they said that this time we're letting you off, but next time it's going to be worse. So you have to increase the number of Anganwadi centers to 1.8 million. And so state by state, scheme by scheme, not just through the courts, through public pressure, through parliamentary advocacy. It wasn't just, it was men, women, boys, girls on the streets. As you know, the Right to Food campaign was one of the most vibrant campaigns of its time, protesting and ensuring that all these schemes were put into place. And of course, at some stage, we were also, in 2004, there was a mechanism that was set up called the National Advisory Council, which was an interface between civil society and government. And the advantage that this interface had, and it was not just another NGO body, was simply that it was headed by the chairperson of the ruling party at that point, Mrs. Sonia Gandhi. And therefore, you had a mechanism now and it was set up in the PMO. So you had a mechanism where we could, fight for our rights and move towards legislation. And so we also, as commissioners, because the commissioners were also part of this body, at some stage we went to the government and said that, look, there's almost $40-50 billion of schemes a year that we are monitoring, right? You can't make a single change. Literally, I would say government would propose something, and from the commissioner's office, Deepa and I would say, no, you can't make this change. Government of India couldn't make the change, and it's ridiculous. That's not how a country is meant to be run in any case. Certainly not for such large-scale programming. And therefore, what we then proposed to the government of the day was, why don't you make a legislation around it where you build in the monitoring mechanism, you build in the grievance redressal, and it's totally yours. We shut the court case down. The commissioners are out of the picture. It goes back into government, because this is really something which is in the legislative domain. Because if you look at it dispassionately, courts are not meant to run this country, right? The Supreme Court is not to order or ensure that whether 100 kilocalories of food is being served or 8 grams of protein is being served in a midday meal, or if a Dalit cook is there or not. They can step in when there is a violation. They can step in for grievance redressal, but they can't really be running large-scale programs where government is implementing it. To sit on oversight on every single detail, it defeats the purpose of democracy, of electoral democracy. And that's how the legislation and the discussion around the National Food Security Act came about, which is of course the world's largest food distribution program anywhere, where close to 1 billion people today are getting food grains which are free from the state, right? Free of cost from the state. At that time it was not free. It was 1 rupee, 2 rupees and 3 rupees per kilo, depending on whether it was rice, wheat or millets. But now of course with COVID, it was a safety net that was available. And we got this done. And of course, it was not an ideal situation. Remember, all advocacy, right? Anything you do in the public policy space, it is always a very contested territory when you go in a civil society. And it is never a smooth ride, right? It's 5 steps forwards, 4 steps backwards sometimes. Because at the end of the day, all advocacy really is a tussle between the real and the ideal. You may have an ideal situation, but fiscal resources may not permit it, or the will of the state at that point may not permit it, or you are not able to exert enough pressure from the ground through your public mobilization to bring the change that you want to bring, right? Sometimes you succeed, sometimes you do not succeed. So it was not an ideal act in any case, but it still provides for 1 billion people. It establishes the principle of universality of rights, and universality is very, very important. When we were drawing up these programs, people said, what is the point in having it for everyone? When everyone will not use, there will be a lot of leakage, people will steal the food grains. But our argument was that you may have universal access, right? You may declare a program universal, but it should be self-targeting in a way that, and all these programs for poor are self-targeting. Somebody who is very rich is not going to stand in a ration queue. And if you see, because we had this element of universality built in, how it comes back to you. Just I'll give you one example. The National Rural Employment Guarantee Act is a universal act, which means anybody can go and demand. If you go back to your village tomorrow because you lost your job at TIS, you say, I want to dig a hole, or whatever is the NREGA program, the state is obliged to provide you at minimum wages. But of course, the offtake of the program was not there. But the moment COVID hit, right, a large number of people who were, let's say, from Orissa working as migrant labor in Surat, there are 7 lakh people. Suddenly, all the diamond polishing units shut down for 3 years. And they come back to their respective states, right? And what do? There are 2 options. Earlier, if there was no legal guarantee, they would have starved to death. But because there was a legal guarantee, they went back to work as part of the NREGAs, right? When the situation improved, they stopped working, they went back to Surat, back to their jobs which were paying them more than what NREGA was paying. So the principle of universality actually is so key, because it then allows people to become vulnerable. Because, poverty is not a one-time journey. Progress out of poverty is not a one-time journey, right? Even one adverse health event in the family, as you know, can bring forget a poor, it can bring a middle-class family to the brink of poverty in India. And of course, in India, if you are earning 25,000 rupees a month, you're amongst the top 25% of people, right, in the country, because 75% doesn't earn even 25,000 rupees a month. So, therefore, the principle of universality in public policy scheme, the fact that you have accountability either through a judicial mechanism or through a administrative mechanism, the fact that along with universal coverage, you have a budget that is allocated for every program, that ensures that it is, again, it's a battle year on year, and as Deepa works on budgets of food programs even now, I don't look at them anymore, haven't for the last few years, for many years, but she can tell you that every year, if you adjust for inflation, our budget on food is actually going down. If you take scheme wise, the midday meal, the ICDS, if you budget for inflation, we are not even matching inflation, right? And therefore, what happens in the school, because it's not inflation indexed, dal prices go up. What does the teacher do? Add water, make it watery. And then once you made it watery, you felt, okay, next time, even if the prices come down, you would just take some dal home, right? Or you sell it and make some money. But if it was inflation indexed, that wouldn't happen, right? So these are still battles that need to be fought. It is not my argument that the right to food in India is a settled right. And one of the failings of the act, or rather something that we couldn't bring in because reality caught up with us and the state was not willing to do. On one side, on the supply side, we could not secure for our farmers a legal guarantee on the minimum support price. If we had secured for our farmers a legal guarantee, then you wouldn't have had these farm laws, and you wouldn't have had the farmers' protest. If we had got, because our farmers are also, they are producers, yes, but they are also the largest set of consumers of food, right? Because farming in India doesn't provide enough for every farm. Your average holding is less than 2 hectares. So on one hand, that was something we could not secure. On the other hand, we could not move the discourse really from hunger to malnutrition, right? And malnutrition has many, many aspects. You can, hunger is only one part of the malnutrition, because if you're obese, you are undernourished, right? You are malnourished if you're obese, because it's called the double burden of malnutrition. As you know, it's not just undernutrition, but it's also obesity. And India has become the global epicenter of this double burden of malnutrition crisis, because on one hand, diabetes and obesity and other related illnesses, and then on the other hand, you have a crisis of hunger as well. So it's not my argument that it is settled. I think we still have to go a long way in our fight against nutrition, and there are many, there are many social determinants of nutrition, which we may not think as having a direct impact, but they do. And I would think that one of the, think of sanitation. We don't think of sanitation as a nutrition program. We don't think of sanitation as a program that is going to, change the status of malnutrition. But the reality is that sanitation is very, very key, because absorption. So you have, in food, you have access, you have availability, but you also have absorption. If you are chronically ill because of poor hygiene and the infections that follow, you will never be able to absorb the food that you eat. And therefore, sanitation becomes key to ensuring that you're not malnourished. And I think you have to see programs like Swachh Bharat Abhiyan and others, which have placed, and I think it's a good thing that the intent of the state was extremely good in introducing Swachh Bharat Abhiyan and bringing it onto the policy, to the focus as a public program, as something that all Indians should be conscious about. Because you can't have a country which makes any claim to development if 50% of people are, openly defecating, right? So these are all programs that are linked to nutrition one way or the other. Having decent primary health care is a key determinant of, how well nourished your society will be or not. Having a good, decent quality access to primary health care. Now, when these laws were drawn up, unfortunately, again, these were not things that we could build it, because no law can be all comprehensive. So these are battles that we have left for you, the next generation, to fight. And so it's not something that we could do, but hopefully you will be able to take this journey forward and fight it.
My name is Tariq Sohail. As you mentioned during your commissionerate in the Supreme Court, you said that you tried to push in the marginalized society as the cook. So, this came off just as an instance, or was there a deliberate need for those things to, I just want some query on it. Maybe there might be some other questions,
Okay.
but this is, thank you.
So, sir, like...
What is your name? Just introduce yourself.
So, I'm Azad.
Azad, yeah. Please tell me.
So, sir, like you have rightly mentioned about this midday meal and the status, like how the secretaries are coming in front of court and they are just... But what, like as a practitioner, as a field practitioner, I'm just looking into the loophole of the program actually. Yes, at the policy level, it is very sound and very concrete, but the ground implementation is really very worse, because we are just working with the communities.
Where?
In Bihar.
Right.
So we see like how this food is being prepared, and the food is being just, and there are again the issues of corruption. I think it is well known. So how as a as a scholar you see the future of such programs, because as the contemporary generation we have still faith of improving the situation, but because you have very vast understanding of this subject matter, so I would like to know like where we will reach, like, and what is the scope. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, hi, good morning. I'm Dr. Ajit. I teach sociology and social work at ISER Bhopal. And it was great to listen you, particularly about the trajectory of food security, how it started. And it was also fascinating to hear that there is a provision that a Dalit cook should be there. But at the same time, we have seen there has not been issue when Dalit cook have been appointed at several places, ranging from Madhya Pradesh, UP, Bihar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, many
Yes.
places. So, and there is always oppose from a section of society, and it also have often get outraged at national level. So, how we are going to deal with that kind of questions? Thank you.
Right. There was a question there, yeah, two questions from there and then one more.
Uh, Hello, sir. My name is Jasmeet, and I want to ask about the PDS system. Currently, government is giving some of the dry rations in the state, and it looks more on the food security, not on the nutritional security
Yes.
of the part. So there is enough calorie intake which is
Yeah.
like given to people, but like shouldn't it be like now looked at as a with the lens of nutritional security?
Hello, sir. I'm Sakshi. So I wanted to ask, with the right of food in place, do we have any mechanism for the quality checks? Since there are so many cases in the midday scheme as well where kids lose their life. So is there any mechanism at place? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Nishat Hatullah. My question is that although the people are aware about food security, they are not or really aware about nutrition security at the ground level. So, what would you suggest to create an awareness about it among people? Because right now the concept is if we are eating anything, that is enough for me. But they're really not aware about the nutritional benefits and the requirements. So, at a ground level, if I'm working at an NGO, how can I promote about nutrition security?
Yeah. Okay, one last question, then we can. Okay, two last questions. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, I wanted to ask, while I acknowledge that you were able to bring about all these reforms, but when you speak to us today, we work in an entirely different context.
Yeah.
You put a time frame till 2014. This activism was possible. But I mean, I was very young then. But as far as I remember, there was a very vibrant civil society movement that supported this activism. So now, when I look at it, I mean, even in the judicial scape, say, Human Rights Law Network is not around anymore now.
New India.
So, I mean, the strategies of how we organize these movements then possibly have to change, and we
Right.
don't really have the judicial activism. I mean, it has been attempted in the New India, as you say, and it has not been encouraged whatsoever. Then, secondly, I think what you talked about here, the supply side that was never really spoke about, and the supply side that seems to be, I mean, of particular interest to the private sector right now, or getting involved in it. I mean, the farm laws weren't the only interventions. Scholars who work there already say that at least to outcompete things such as APMCs, the private sector, at least to, supplying credit or through. So it's trying to vouch its place as being the primary distributor of food in India. And the government seems to be very keen on this. And in that context, where do you see the future of food security?
Okay. What's your name?
Udayan.
Udayan.
Yes.
Yeah. And where do you study, Udayan?
I'm a master's student at the Delhi School of Economics.
Yes, very good, very good.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
I am Anjali. And my question is related to MSPs. So you said ki guaranteeing MSPs can help in coping with food insecurity. So MSPs are not something that can be provided always. Like it was planned to be used when prices go below a certain margin. So what do you mean by guaranteeing MSPs, and how it can help in coping with food insecurity?
Yeah. Last question,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
then we'll go.
Sir,
down.
I'm Praveen, faculty from University of Mumbai.
Yeah.
My question is, does right to food offers any right to the beneficiary to choose, right to choose his entitlements? Because there are a lot of incidences when I work with the tribals. The staple food of tribals is basically rice. And government is
They're given
offering them
wheat.
wheat. And in that conditions, they have to sell this wheat at throwaway prices. And there are other alternative mechanisms that private players are there, and they're
Okay.
taking, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Praveen. So let me just 3-4 questions I'll take on, and we can of course continue the discussion in the panel. See, the fundamental difference in India in a public program as compared to, say, in Europe or in US is that our programming always has multiple objectives. Now, if you take the UK, of course, we have been campaigning for a right to food in the UK also, particularly school meal program. And school meal programs are incredibly popular everywhere in the world, right? And if you tinker with them, you get really hurt. Governments get hurt. So, for instance, in the UK, you had a program where they used to give milk to children. And when Margaret Thatcher came to power, she, as part of the reform, she removed that program. And the slogan amongst the children went, Maggie Thatcher Milk Snatcher, Thatcher Thatcher Milk Snatcher. And it was subsequently restored. Of course, it's not a universal program now, but it's means tested, but they do have a program. Now there it's very simple, or in the US, kids have to be fed, somebody will feed the kids. And that's the program, end of story. There's nothing more to it. But in India, it's linked. Why do you have a midday meal program? The immediate benefit, first benefit comes is girls' enrollment. And we saw phenomenal increase in girls' enrollment. Girls who were left home for sibling care started going to school, right? So everything in India is linked to discrimination, caste and gender, right? These are the three pillars on which you operate. So every public program will see that. Therefore, we went to the court and said that use cooks who are Dalits. Because you are absolutely right that of course upper castes are protesting. Many upper castes don't either, because the law is there, you cannot change the cook. The cook is Dalit. So their solution is to bring their own food from home, or they will tell their children not to eat that food. But they would do that if they have that privilege, right? If they have the money and they have the resources. But in vast number of cases, the fact that children of all castes are sitting together to eat a meal itself becomes a variable in changing notions of caste right at the time when the child goes to school. And yes, there will be resistance, since when have laws been able to, society doesn't keep pace with laws. We've banned discrimination under the constitutional scheme of things 75 years ago. And yet caste is the oldest institutionalized system of oppression in the world that still continues till to this date, right? And I am myself upper caste. My positionality is that, but I have no hesitation in saying that this is a crime of the highest order that is being committed against our fellow human beings. Caste is a scourge on our society, and we are not able to deal with it, right? There's no other part of the world where we have a competitive advantage of discriminating against our fellow human beings. In India, I would say South Asia, women and people who are lower in the caste hierarchy. I mean, the whole system is built around oppression, and there is no other place in the world where you will treat somebody as untouchable by sight or by touch. And therefore, it was very important that we put this in, which doesn't mean, and you're absolutely right, my friend, that every day in the newspapers you read there is some protest in a school or children have refused to eat because the cook is a Dalit cook. But at least the cook stays, right? And this debate that gets sparked off, this fight that happens on the ground every time, is one step brings us one step closer to fighting the caste system, which we must. Second, on dry rations, Jasmeet, your question that which was that should we not have move beyond this and do things now in the PDS now, which is linked also, how do you address nutrition security? Look, once you have the basics in place, then states will do it. So Tamil Nadu, for instance, already provides for dal. It already provides for pulses. It provides for cooking oil. Many other states have followed suit. When there were elections in UP for a few months, we saw oil being given in the PDS, courtesy Wilmar Adani, CSR. And then, but it's now there in people's mind that oil can be provided in the PDS. When conditions improve, they will agitate, protest, organize and get oil. They would do that. One hopes that systems would improve. And I absolutely agree that our focus on calories is taking away. Yes, we need to deal with macro hunger, but we need better quality of diets. IFPRI and others have done a lot of work on this quality of diets question. You should look up that research. Because we are a very, very diverse country and we need that diversity. Sakshi's questions on mechanisms for redress, in case it doesn't work, you have a district food commission, you have a state food commission. In the act, we envisage, again, the real and the ideal. We had envisaged really independent mechanisms. Now it has become a vehicle for employing retired bureaucrats. It's just become an employment opportunity for civil servants. In most states, civil society is neither consulted, let alone been appointed to these commissions. On the question of MSP, no, actually not, Anjali. Minimum support price meant a guarantee. It was not contingent on what the market price is. Minimum support price was always a guarantee that the state will buy at this price. And the reason why we did that, because India has been, we are one of the least corporatized food systems, the least corporatized food systems anywhere in the world. The state is still the largest player, right? And it is likely to remain so for a long time to come. Now, therefore, the state uses the strategic reserves that are procured as part of the minimum support price for market intervention operations, in addition to the PDS. How do you lower prices? You are giving through the PDS, so at least the poorest of the poor, or at least 75% of the country that has access to this, gets it at PDS rates. So that itself is a barrier. Then let's assume for local factors, prices suddenly go up in Assam or in 7 states of the Northeast. Because the Food Corporation of India has a stock holding at any point of 20-30 million tons, they'll say, okay, fine, we'll shift 15 million tons, or not 15 million, but say 1 million ton or 2 million tons to for a market intervention operation, where they release this at much lower prices. So the hoarder who's hoarding the grain will suddenly have the price crash, and the consumer gets it at a cheaper price. So therefore, the idea of the MSP was always that it would be a minimum support price. And even though it's not a legal guarantee, it is a virtual legal guarantee. And the farmers have shown, government doesn't want another 1 million farmers on the doorsteps of Delhi anytime soon. So it's going to remain, but it will be good to be legislated in any case. On the issue of, the rights holders, yes, of course they have a choice. You could choose between rice, wheat and millet. But in many parts of the country, this is theory. So I would urge that if you are working with communities, find an organization that can take up their case. Because in Maharashtra, it's not very difficult to provide rice. It's not very difficult for the state to provide rice. If there is a court, either through advocacy or through litigation, this is a relatively easy problem to solve. If you give me some details, I'll put you in touch with activists who are working on this. Now I come to I've saved the Udayan. I'm going to answer your question. I was just saving the best for the last, as they say. So yes, things are very difficult, because civil society can only operate in an environment where there are political opportunity structures available to it. And civil society is of many kinds, right? Some civil society thrives under repression. So human rights defenders would thrive under repression. They would, people who fight for civil liberties would really find great opportunities today in India and many other parts of the world. Civic space is a very key issue, because if you do not have civic space, you cannot do it. If you cannot agitate, if you cannot organize, if you cannot, if you are put into jail the moment you raise your voice, it obviously doesn't provide you with the means to carry out these battles which are rights-based. But on the other hand, as you have seen with the farmers' movement and with the CNRC and other agitations, those who have struggled have always prevailed. And I would say that it is the weakness of many of our struggles which have not been deepened enough, that cannot take on the state at any point in time. It doesn't matter which political party or which ideology or whoever is in power. There is no power that is bigger than people's power. And if we have failed to capitalize on that, and particularly institutionalize civil society, it is also a reminder to us that we sort of kind of double down on our efforts and make this happen. And always remember that democracy is a work in progress. We are not gifted with democracy. We have a democracy, it's a work in progress, and we have to keep fighting for our rights. We have to keep fighting till we get those rights. And there is no power that is less than people's power, right? More important than people's power. And lastly, I would say that look at the United States, right? It's a 250 years oldest democracy in the world, so to say, one of the largest democracies in the world. Always lecturing is about human rights, about this. But they elected Trump once and they might re-elect him again. So if a deep old democracy like the US is in the state that it is, they kept telling us our election should be free and fair. Every 2 weeks, their presidential candidate, there's an assassination attempt, right? Look at the amount of fake news, misinformation. Look at the amount of gerrymandering that happens in electoral districts there. The whole system seems to be totally bankrupt after 250 years. We are only 75 years, right? It's the 75th year of the Constitution. So democracy is a work in progress. You should always have, keep your faith. Things will change, they will improve. And our best, we saw in the elections that despite all the difficulties and all the challenges, people delivered a verdict, right? They delivered a verdict, and next elections they will deliver another verdict. And if governments do not or remain anti-people, then they will not come back to power. So I have a deep and abiding faith in Indian democracy and Indian democratic processes, as you must. While I acknowledge entirely that the space today has completely shrunk, especially for young people, my colleagues come and complain to me that, we have seen no other time but this. We have never been able to engage. We are not able to agitate or organize or protest. And it's really a different environment, and we only read about it or see it in theory. But despite all that, I would say keep your faith. We will ultimately win this. So, thank you.